for this more rapidly changing work world, you want to have a whole toolbox of solutions that you can bring to something so you don't get stuck applying the same solution to a changing problem.
Welcome to the podcast Heja Framtiden, a Swedish podcast on the future. My name is Christian von Essen. Today I'm sitting at Volante's office, the publishing house in Gamla Stan in Stockholm, together with David Epstein. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us, why are you in Sweden at the moment?
I was invited by TV4 for a conference about business growth, basically. But I also have personal ties here, so I'm combining work with pleasure.
And also, of course, you're here at Volante to do some promotion for your book called Range, and came out in the US 2019, and here in Sweden it's called Bredd, came out probably 2021?
I think so.
Yeah.
I believe so.
Something like that. And I think I jumped at this opportunity to meet you because I thought the book resonated with me so profoundly, probably from a selfish angle, because I see myself as a generalist in many ways. But can you tell us a bit about the backstory? Why did you write Range to begin with?
Yeah, the backstory. I'll give you the sort of longer version here, which is that I wrote a first book about genetics and athleticism, physical skills. And in it, I attacked some of the research that underlies the so-called 10,000 hours rule, the idea that there's no such thing as talent and no route to expertise other than 10,000 hours of very focused practice. And that brought me into some debates with the author Malcolm Gladwell. And the first of those, because he had popularized the 10,000 hours rule, the first of those debates was at a sports data conference organized by some executives in the NBA, the National Basketball Association. And in that debate, he said, you know, it's very important for people to get a head start in deliberate practice. That's the most important thing. And I said, well, here's what the data say from the research that has followed athletes. It shows that, in fact, the ones who go on to become elite early on have what's called a sampling period, where they do a variety of things. They spend time in some non-deliberate practice, in sort of playful activities. They learn these general skills, and only later do they specialize. And he, to his credit, said, you know, that work doesn't fit with what I've been saying. Tell me more. And he and I ended up becoming running partners and arguing about these things on our own time, what we called the Roger versus Tiger problem, where Tiger Woods specialized very early in golf. Roger Federer played like a dozen different sports before he focused in on tennis. And the Roger model is the one that the science says is the norm. And the Tiger model is the one that the science says is the exception, even though that's the one that everybody knows. And so we started talking about this Roger versus Tiger problem. And that became Roger versus Tiger, became the title of the first chapter, the introduction to the book. And then we got curious. We got curious to argue about it in other domains outside of sports, just to use sports as an analogy. And so that got me interested in what pattern we would see in other areas of work.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Malcolm Gladwell popularized the notion of 10,000 hours, but it was scientifically put forward by Anders Ericsson, I think.
Anders Ericsson,
Swedish, and is an American partner in the book called Peak, which probably is around here somewhere. I think they published it. It's right over there. And it was kind of a convenient notion for people, I think, that all you need is 10,000 hours, or as they stress, that you need deliberate practice. You need to challenge yourself. You can't just put in 10,000 hours of anything and become an expert. Maybe you mentioned that. What is the problem with that notion? Is it that we sort of think that this kind of expertise comes easy if you just put in the time?
I think there are a few problems. So, and by the way, before Peak, Anders Ericsson first started writing about this idea like 30 years before that book. In his scientific work, probably in 1993 was his most famous paper. And actually, that paper, I think, exemplifies some of the problems. So maybe I'll start with that. So in 1993, he put out a paper that studied people at a world-famous music academy in Germany. And what it found was that the It was 30 people only, so it was a tiny study, and it found that the 10 best violinists, those who the teachers thought could go on to become international soloists, had put in 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Again, this is like focused on error correction, not just playing around. 10,000 hours of deliberate practice on average by age 20, whereas the next group down had put in less and the next group down had put in less. So a few problems here. One is the problem of what scientists call a restriction of range, where you already started with people who are excelling at the thing that you're studying. And that can cause all sorts of problems, like when you pre-select them. That doesn't tell you about a model for everyone else. So to give a funny example, in my first book, when I looked at the correlation between height among American men and points scored in the National Basketball Association, it was a very positive correlation, as you might imagine. But then if you restrict the range to only people who are already professional basketball players, then the correlation becomes negative because the small guys score more. So if you didn't know what you were doing, you would tell parents to have shorter children to score more points in basketball because you can end up with these really perverse conclusions. So that was one problem. The other problem was in that famous paper, they didn't print any measures of variance, meaning 10,000 hours was an average, but they didn't say how much or how little other people had done. And so I got in touch with Anders Ericsson to talk about this sort of thing. And years later, they shared data that showed some people had practiced way less than that, and some people had practiced way more, and some people in the lower level had practiced more than some people in the higher level, and this was just an average. And you can have, like, in all these areas of study, like in chess expertise, it takes 11,053 hours on average to reach international master status. But some people have made it in 3,000 hours, and some people are being followed and they're at 25,000 hours and they still haven't made it. So you can have an 11,053 hour rule, but it doesn't really tell you anything about the reality of how human skill develops and the importance of matching what you're doing to your talents and of doing things other than deliberate practice. So I think there were a whole host of problems with that work that Anders and I argued about before I ever argued about it with Malcolm Gladwell.
And you admit that specializing early gives you a head start in that you will probably get a better job, you will get higher salary than the generalist who's not as focused. But the generalist kind of wins over time because the specialist doesn't have the stamina or the strength to carry on with the specialty or the focus. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, let me describe a specific study that's getting at what you're getting at. And because I think that is like the core thesis of my book is that there's a trade-off between short-term and long-term development. And sometimes optimizing the short-term can undermine the long-term. So one good example of that I write about is from an economist who studied the university education systems in England and Scotland. And when he studied them, they were almost identical. The difference was in England, students had to pick a specialty when they were about 15 years old. And in Scotland, they could keep trying different things through university if they wanted to. And his question was, who usually wins the trade-off, the early or the late specializers? And what he saw was that the early specializers, like you said, they jump out to an income lead because they have more domain-specific skills. The late specializers get to try more different things. When they do pick, they have better what economists call match quality. That's the degree of fit between your interests and abilities and the work that you do. And so they have higher growth rates. That's very important for performance, match quality. So they have higher growth rates. So by about 6 years out of school, they fly past the early specializers in income. Meanwhile, the early specializers start quitting their career tracks in much higher numbers, despite having more disincentive from doing so, essentially because they were made to choose so early, they more often made poor choices that didn't fit their interests and abilities as well. On top of that, there's been another body of research showing that these people with a broader base are more able to respond to like changes to their industry, and so that they will end up out of work less or being more flexible and more mobile. And so what they lose in earnings early on, they more often than not make up in long-term success.
It kind of translates to this podcast as well, because I interviewed about 400 people now, very specific domain experts and industry experts, scientists, etc. And I often feel like I don't know anything. You know, the more I talk to people, the less I'm certain of anything, because they all have different perspectives. Mm-hmm. But what I do know is that I can now begin to form my own thoughts, because I am the generalist. I can see all these different pieces of the puzzle. They only see one piece of the puzzle. An AI researcher will only see AI when talking about the future, or not only, but more specifically. A blockchain expert will see blockchain as the most important aspect of future technology. So that's why I think I was really happy to find your book and to learn that there is a future for me as well. But can you explain why generalists will you say triumph in a world full of specialists? Or?
Yeah, and then I want to go back to expand on what you just said too, if you'll allow me. But the general reason is that we're in a work world that specialization, a greater degree of specialization, made a lot of sense earlier in the 20th century when we were largely an industrial economy where people would face work next year would look like work last year. What psychologist Robin Hogarth calls a kind learning environment. People could learn how to do a thing and then they could just do the thing. But now in this information or knowledge or creativity economy or whatever you want to call it, people have to do what psychologists call transfer, which is take skills and knowledge and apply it in new situations that they haven't seen before. And it turns out that in many cases, that's where people who are broader, who have broader experiences and broader skills and collect perspectives, excel when they are placed in a new situation where they have to apply their knowledge flexibly, whether that's, in the arts or whether that's in technological innovation. And so the faster the work world changes, the more advantage there is for people who have this broader base that they can use to pivot, basically, strategically. But I'd love to expand on what you said, if you'll allow me, because you think a lot about the future, obviously, and you described yourself as a collector of perspectives, but also as becoming more unsure of anything. You're basically describing like chapter 10 of the book in the most famous work ever done on forecasting the future. 20 years long research project, 83,000 predictions about people had to make predictions about economic and technological and trends and all this stuff and political trends. And the worst forecasters turned out to be the most narrowly specialized experts because they'd come to see the whole world through kind of one lens or mental model, and they wrapped everything around that one view. And they would even get worse as they gained experience in their field. Whereas the people who did well, sometimes they had areas of expertise, sometimes they didn't. But more important than what they thought was how they thought. They were, as the researcher who led the work described it, perspective collectors. He said they had dragonfly eyes. Dragonfly's eyes are made of thousands of different lenses, each one of which takes a different picture. They're then synthesized in the dragonfly's brain. So these people would have their ideas and they would say, let me go figure out how to falsify my own idea and collect all these different perspectives. And they ended up being the best, the people who could see the best in the future. The downside was they often became sort of less certain of their own beliefs, like you said, but that made them more accurate.
Wow, a dragonfly.
Dragonfly eyes, yeah.
Wow.
Kind of unseemly analogy, but...
I'm going to start calling myself that. As you mentioned, I think in your TED Talk, chess and golf are great examples of, where you actually can specialize early because they exist in a kind environment. Is that what you call it?
Yeah.
But the world does not look like that, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah.
The world is a wicked environment.
Yeah.
Is that why you can't rely on a specialization? You need the experience, the foundation to adapt.
Yeah, I think even if you do have a specialization, you need to have some breadth beyond that. So to explain those are terms from the psychologist Robin Hogarth. Kind learning environment means a situation where the rules are clear and never change, patterns repeat, next steps are clear, feedback is quick and accurate, work next year will look like work last year. Golf, for sure. Chess, based on knowledge of repetitive patterns, but not the work that most of us are in, which he described as a more wicked learning environment where work next year might not look like work last year. Feedback could be delayed. Lots of human behaviors involved. Feedback could be inaccurate. Patterns don't just repeat and rules can change. And in that situation, it's really important not to fall prey to what psychologists call the Einstellung effect, which is, it means it's like getting stuck. When you've solved a certain problem a certain way so many times, you will keep using that solution automatically, even if it's not the solution to the problem anymore. That's like what these bad forecasters were doing. They were always using the same lens, even when the problem was different. And so even if you do have an area of deep expertise, for this more rapidly changing work world, you want to have a whole toolbox of solutions that you can bring to something so you don't get stuck applying the same solution to a changing problem.
Yeah, and I would assume that managers can probably use your book in order to think about team building in a new way? Because, I mean, putting together a team is usually an exercise where you gather experts to solve a problem, but you sort of tend to forget the range, I think.
I agree. I mean, I think that, there were a few places in the book where I talk about teams, like one, for example, where a researcher who was studying teams working on innovation and problem solving, he was embedded with the team. So he got to watch them work, and he would see teams of all deep experts with the same expertise who would sometimes get in one case, he saw a team that was all expertise in one area, in the same area, and another team that had this real diversity of areas of interest and levels of experience. And they got stuck on the same problem at the same time, similar times. And he saw the one that had all people who had the same experience were really stuck, and they had to do lots of trial and error for months. Whereas the other team solved it the day it came up, because they all started bringing in, well, maybe this is like this other problem in my area. Or they all started making analogies from their own area until one fit, and they solved it that day. And so it was like they basically effectively had a bigger brain, that had many more antennas, because they were able to play off of each other and make analogies to each other for problem solving. And so this team diversity was really useful. And I think that also shows up in research on patents, technological patents, where you see the most impactful patents tend to be authored by groups that include people who have worked in it can include some specialists, but also includes people who've worked in a bunch of different areas of technology, who are often like acting as a bridge between people from different areas. And so I think we can often, it's obvious for people to put specialists on their team. I think it's less obvious, but really advantageous, to include these people who can sort of build bridges between knowledge and have diversity of experience.
In Sweden, we have a problem with politicians being full-time political experts from the day they were head of the student council in their school or something like that. And they were engaged in the youth organization, and then they become professional politicians, basically with no experience in the industry or life in general, or failure. Yeah. But I think Sweden is kind of an ageist society. It's very difficult to get around as an older person. I mean, in the US, you have politicians who are 70, 80 years old. It's not always a good idea either, but at least they have a variety of experiences. Are we sort of stuck in a chronological trap in a way, do you think? Is that why we always tend to focus on early specialization? That was basically my question.
I think in the sense that and tell me if I'm interpreting it correctly, but I think we overemphasize what seems like people being precocious and succeeding early. Whereas okay, MIT and the US Census Bureau came out with a study in 2019 that showed that the average age of a founder of a fast-growing tech startup, top 0.01% of growth, on the day of founding was 45, right? That's pretty surprising to most people, because usually we only hear the story of like a Mark Zuckerberg, who when he was 22 said, he dropped out of college and founded his company, and when he was 22 said, young people are just smarter, right? He doesn't say that anymore, obviously. But we focus on that story even though it's the exception, whereas the reality is of most of the people that are successful is that they had to zig and zag and wind their way around, but their stories are not nearly as dramatic. So these stories of early success, I think, one, we assume that that's a linear trajectory and that person is just going to continue, which is totally belied by all sorts of research on youth prodigies who just peak early. They just develop faster, not longer. But I think we're sort of hypnotized or mesmerized by those sorts of stories of young success. And so I think we need to put less emphasis on precocity and recognize that human development is not so linear. And, to add, you mentioned the problem of politicians just only having experience in politics, where they're kind of not generalists or specialists, they're just dilettantes. We've had, recently, I think, a different version of the problem where someone who was perceived to have done well in business, in real estate, whether that was true or not, people decided, well, therefore, because he was a specialist in this, then he'll be good at running anything. And the idea was, I think you're not going to learn about a lot of things if you're not actively curious about a lot of things. So incuriosity from politicians, whether it's because they've only been involved in politics or they've only been involved in something else, I think incuriosity is a massive problem for politicians.
Which brings me to my final question that I ask everyone on this podcast. What is your best tip for making the world a better place in the future?
Wow. You mean like other than like figuring out carbon sequestration or something like that? Because my background was in was in environmental science. I think this is not going to come from any of my like research, but just from my personal experience, which is to take at least every year like an actual break from social media. I think social media can be used to expand your knowledge and your connections in a great way, but I think you need to take at least like a few weeks, maybe a month even of time, or take the app off your phone for a while, because it will feel like a smaller part of your life when you get back, and you'll have more expanded thinking about the things that are around you. And so I would recommend that everyone do that, because I think it's getting increasingly difficult to do, but I think it becomes a competitive advantage if you can stop for a little while and look at the world in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a good any good reading tip or a podcast tip?
Oh, I mean, I think that reading something that is hard for you is an incredible experience. So I take notes like when I read things. Let me give a nonfiction book recommendation that I think this audience would probably like. Loon Shots by Safi Bakal. Loon Shots, not moonshots, loon shots. And it's about how crazy ideas can either blow up or lead to massive innovation. And he was a physicist and biotech entrepreneur, and I really like his book. And it's a fascinating look at how organizations go right or wrong with big ideas, usually in like science and medicine. In fiction, I know this is going to be so cliche, but people really should read War and Peace, because it's not just a ponderous Russian epic. It's Tolstoy's argument against the so-called great man theory of history, the idea that only a very small number of prominent men like create history and everyone else is irrelevant. And it's an amazing argument against that. And I think with some of the leadership trends we're seeing in the world right now, the view that he takes on leadership through both his story and some historical reporting that's in the book is a very different view than the one we're being sold by overconfident leaders who act like they are the only ones who can direct history.
Who do you think I should interview?
I think you should interview Alex Hutchinson, he was also a physicist, and he was an elite level runner. He's a Canadian journalist, and he wrote a book about the role of the brain in physical endurance. But in doing that, he started experimenting with brain stimulation to see, could that speed up skill learning and things like that. And I think he found a lot of things didn't work the way they said. But I think we are going to have more direct interface between our brains and technology. And I think he's probably got some interesting thinking about that, as well as Josh Wolf, who's a venture capitalist in the United States, who deals with technology and I know is very interested in the direct interface between the brain and like the ability to control a computer. And I think that is going to happen. I think a lot of trends we're sold can be hype, but that I think is a direction that we're going in. And I think, Josh Wolf, I think he'd be a fascinating person for you to interview.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David Epstein, for joining Her Framtiden.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
DavidEpstein.com, right?
Yeah.
For newsletter, books, TED Talk. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the stuff.
That's it.
Range Widely is the newsletter,
Yeah, Range, what's it called?
Range Widely is my newsletter, and it's, it ranges widely. But a lot of it is about how to pick out good and bad science news.
Okay, great. In your mailbox every week.
Usually. Most weeks.
Most weeks. Great. Check out hejaframtiden.se for more information about this podcast and the stuff I do. My name is Christian von Essen. Thank you so much for listening.